Okay, welcome back. Nice to see you. This is the third talk. So the first talk we did joint speech. The second talk we started to distinguish between language and languaging. So we spoke of one popular way of thinking of language as being about message passing. And this view has been almost the whole of the science of language for the 20th century. And this has been concerned with syntax, with morphology, with phonology, and it sees language as a system. And we saw that, well, you can look at language like that, and then you're looking at things called Chinese, English, French. But I wanted to say that if you start with a different question, then you see something very, very different, and I use the verb languaging for this. And the question I ask is not, how do people pass messages? The question I ask is this: what happened to our species? Something very strange happened to one kind of ape, the human ape. Here we are. It's only 6 million years since the apes and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. 6 million years is not a lot of time for evolution. Evolution works with very, very big intervals of time. And if you compare the bodies of the chimpanzees and bonobos and the humans, they're nearly the same. The brains are nearly the same. There's no cell type in a chimpanzee brain that you don't also find in a human brain. The structures are the same. There's some differences. In humans, we have big frontal lobes. The front of the brain is bigger, and we lost a lot of hair, so we're not very hairy, most of us. But that's about it. Now, if you learnt generative linguistics, you probably learnt about something called universal grammar. And you probably heard that this was a product of evolution. I'm going to tell you it's not. Universal grammar is not a product of biological evolution. There is no genetic story to be told here. We will look at the little bit of study of genetics and language. We need to think very hard if we want to understand what it was that so transformed our species. And I don't believe the answer will be genetics. Now, if we look back in the fossil record and ask, when did our species start? How old is humanity? Well, I don't like the term humanity. Homo sapiens is the term for our species. Homo sapiens anatomically is about 1 million years old, more or less. And that's not very old. And we don't know when language started, but the earliest evidence we have that tells us these were people like us who had something like culture is only about 50,000 years old. So that's about 1/20th of the time that we have been Homo sapiens. Now the evidence here is indirect. This is a bone flute for making music. So once more we see music coming about together with language, maybe. There's evidence from the way that people tended fire that they were coordinating successfully. We've got the very earliest example of people making, should we call it art? Making pictures, drawing on walls, making the hand impressions on walls. And we find small beads that suggest they might have rituals. Now, when it comes to joint speech, we saw the rituals are a very, very important way in which we create a common world, a human world. So, if we want to understand language, we probably want to understand something that happened over about 50,000 years. And it happened after about 950,000 years in which no biological change is obvious. How should we understand this? Well, when we discussed the other view of language, language 1 we called it, that sees syntax and message passing, when we discussed that, we said it's strange that this view of language doesn't seem to care whether we talk about the voice or whether we talk about writing. In fact, it almost prefers writing, because when you write, you have letters, so you get phonemes, you've got words, you've got sentences, so you get syntax. Now, writing is much more recent, so I tried to draw out a time scale here. I want you to see the scales here at the bottom. So, I'm sure you all use emojis when you're using your smartphones. Yeah? They're brilliant. Emojis are fantastic, and they are changing the way we communicate. Don't think of them as trivial. Emojis are extremely important. They are changing the way we communicate, and interestingly, I don't speak Chinese, but I will understand your emojis. Yeah? Amazing. But emojis are about 5 years old. There's a big story about how they came into being, but they are changing our writing, they are changing our communication, but they're only 5 years old. So if you want to understand language, you don't start by understanding emojis. That's very recent. If you want to understand language and you don't want to assume that everybody reads and writes, then, well, widespread literacy is only about 500 years old. So it's only about 500 years that most people in most societies can read and write. Writing itself is only about 5,000 years old. So the blue line here is writing, and although writing is quite old, the very earliest bits were not like writing like we think of it. They were just marks for keeping track of how many things are exchanged and who owns what. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press that texts got to be widely distributed and everyone got to read. So the printing press comes in about here. Modern science only starts about here as well. It's about, modern science is only 500 years old. So just as we wouldn't start to understand writing by looking at the last 5 years, we probably shouldn't start to understand language by looking at the last 500 years. In fact, there's that time scale. Here's the time scale we're really interested in. This is 50,000 years. Here's the whole of writing. Here's the whole of literacy. And emojis are so small now you can't see emojis anymore. So we're trying to understand something that happened in this period of time. So we should not look just at something that's in this period of time. No more than we should start with emojis, should we start with syntax. That's crazy stuff. So it's good to have a sense of history. It tells us, you know, this is what we're interested in, not this. If we start with this question, what happens to our species? Now, writing changes a great, great deal. This is why I think we shouldn't start with writing. It changes the way that we think about language. It changes the way we use language. There are people who don't read and write, and it's not clear to me that these people use words or phonemes. Now you may object, of course they use words or phonemes. But once you start to write, you become aware of the medium of language. You start to think about sentences and words. But if you are from a culture that does not read and write, it's not obvious that this is how you are communicating. So if you ask somebody from a purely oral culture, who's no reading and writing, can you say that again, please? They will not say the same words. They will say the same idea in different words. So I want to just give you an example. Also, when we're asking about history and we're asking about humans, let's not assume we all share a common history. Writing in China has an independent development from writing in Europe and Western Asia. I want to take you on a little tour now. We're going to go as far away from China as we can. We're going to go down here to the bottom of South America, to Tierra del Fuego. This is a very distant place. The weather is very bad. It's usually very cold. It's called Tierra del Fuego because the first time Europeans sailed their boats past here, they saw lots of fires. So this means fireland. The fires were the locals who were warning people, hey, there's Europeans coming, get the hell out, watch out. Because Europeans are always bad news. I'm not going to say Europeans discovered this because there was already people there. Yeah. These are some of the people who were there. His name is Tenenic Ventura. I actually know some of these personally. This is a kind of a wigwam. They come from a tribe called there's two names, Yamana or Yagan. They don't live there now. If you go there now, you find sheep farming, oil extraction, tourism. There's none of these people left. But this photograph is a photograph. This is from about 1918. So these people were exterminated at the start of the 20th century. They had wonderful rituals. They had chant. They did not have reading and writing. And their life is unimaginable to you and me. Here's a picture of them from some of their rituals. I could talk about this ritual. It's wonderful. It's called the Hain. But what I want to do is tell you these are humans too. These are Homo sapiens. And their lives are so different from yours and mine, it's unimaginable. And their lives did not have reading and writing until the end of the 19th century. I've become interested in these. There's two tribes here about which we know a lot before they were exterminated. But my point is they lived down here for 10,000 years. We know that they were in the area for 10,000 years before Europeans came and destroyed them. And some of the Europeans who were there meant well. And they studied their language, and they took those photographs. But if you ask now about the language of the Yagan or the Selknam, what you find, you'll find some things. You'll find translations of the Bible. You'll find the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and a few dictionaries. Now this is a Christian way of thinking about language, obviously. The Bible is not very relevant to people who live 10,000 years in the south of Tierra del Fuego. And remember, the whole of science and the printing press and everything fits in this bar. These people lived there that long. So maybe the Europeans' understanding of the lives of these could be improved. Maybe these are not quasi-Christians, proto-Christians. Maybe they are their own kind of people. So the first European to establish a missionary in Fireland, in Tierra del Fuego, was a guy called Thomas Bridges. Very, very interesting guy. He meant very well. He did mean well. He also wanted to bring the Bible to these people. And he set up a small, first a hut, and then it's now a big town, actually, called Ushuaia. And he tried to learn their language, and he wrote a dictionary. An awful lot of work went into this dictionary. And he made some notes to himself about the difficulties he was having. And there's something to be learned from reading these notes. So about 1890, he said, in writing this language, remember they never have writing, I have been hindered by an indistinctness of pronunciation. They didn't pronounce their language to his satisfaction. And he's trying to use letters. He invented his own phonetic alphabet. He wasn't using the international phonetic alphabet. He sort of modified an old system. It was difficult. But what he said, no doubt when they learn to read this language, their pronunciation will be strengthened. So he feels that when they learn to read and write their language using his system, they will learn to pronounce their language properly, using proper phonemes that are systematic. I hope you can see this is disastrously arrogant. It is unbelievable how short-sighted this is, and it gives no acknowledgement that these people are perfectly fine human beings languaging in their own way. It assumes they're all ready to become Christian and to use letters. Yeah. So he's confident that when they learn to read and write, they'll have phonemes. I'm not so confident. Even sentences are something that make much more sense if you're used to reading and writing. As you all know, in everyday conversation, we use words very differently from the way that we write. Our thoughts go, did you ever actually transcribe what people say in a conversation? It's bizarre. We don't use sentences, we stop and start, and it's, you have to learn to read and write to learn to formulate careful sentences like this. I'm an academic, I'm very good at this, I'm trained to do this. Even in a literate culture like Ireland or China, everyday conversation is not really much like what we write down. So when you write, and when you read and write a lot, you become aware of the medium. You become aware that you're using a particular form of communication. Now I want to tell you, emojis are a new form of medium we're all aware of. Now when we looked at joint speech, we found something else. This is a different kind of activity. We found a behavior that gives rise to a common view. These rituals bring us together and give us a common outlook and help us to form a common society. And we find no big difference between language and music. And we find something that is not really written down. Incidentally, there were chants. The Yagan and the Selknam back in the Fireland had chants. We have one recording of an old woman with 45 minutes of chanting on her own. It's spooky to listen to because nobody thought to find out what that meant. They wanted the Bible. So, if joint speech is older than reading and writing, and we're interested in how humans, Homo sapiens, build their common world. And when we do that, we find no big difference between language and music. Maybe writing caused us to make a difference between language and music. And I want to look now at writing and language and music, because there's something very important to see here. It's something I've only recently realized, and is not widely noted. Of course, we can write music, right? We can write music, and we can write language. And they look different. When we write music, this is one music system. There are several music systems. There are Chinese systems as well. Nobody has ever found a system that works for everybody. I think you'd have to say writing music has not been as successful as writing words, language one. This is the way we write language, and this is the way we write music. So this is a printed text, and this is a musical score. Now we're going to look at the history of these things. A little bit of history. If I talk about a great book, let's take the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, for example, right? It's a book, and if I brought the book, I'd put it on the table and I'd say, that's the Tao Te Ching. It's here. And I could throw it to you, and you could catch it, right? This is the work. But if we think of a piece of music, a work of music like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, I could take the score in, But I would not say that's the symphony. The way to get to the symphony is to perform the score. Right? So here we say we take in the text when you read, it goes in. But here you perform the work. That's an interesting difference. So these are both forms of writing, but they seem to work differently. This one is very intellectual, mental, private. This one is very public, collective. The score, the music, has to be performed to produce sound, whereas the script, also on the page, has to be taken in to produce thoughts, concepts. Isn't that weird? But it didn't used to be like that. This is where a bit of history is useful. If we go back to the earliest forms of music notation, we find no big difference between writing for language and musical notation. This is the way, remember that Gregorian chant we heard from the monks? This is what the way it was written. Here's the words, and here's the guidance for how to sing it, the melody and so on. These are special lines called neumes. There you go, you learned a new word today. So here we have something which is both text and musical notation. And in the early chant, the words were the main thing. This melody and rhythm is ornamentation. It's there to make it more serious, to allow us to do it together. But it's secondary. The focus is on the words. Now I want to think about how people used to read before there were printing presses. A long, long time ago, early readers read aloud. They did not read silently. You and I pick up a book and we read like this. That is not how people used to read. They used to read with their voice. This is St. Augustine, 5th century, very famous Christian philosopher and theologian. And I'm going to quote an anthropologist here, Tim Ingold, who notes, you can read this in your own time, I'm going to point out the important bits. About 400 years after the Common Era, St. Augustine was astonished when he came across another bishop called Ambrose. And Ambrose was reading, and he wasn't making any sounds. His eyes followed the text, his voice and tongue were silent. And Augustine goes, what kind of magic is this? What is he doing? So this is 1600 years ago. Reading was a performance. It was done loud. Augustine thought maybe he's trying to preserve his voice because he has to preach. So maybe he doesn't want to become hoarse. Even Ambrose, this guy who's the first person we know who was reading silently, he wrote of the sounds of the letter. So letters were seen as having sounds. They were much more like, so there's no big difference here between music and language again. And reading, if we go back this far, is much more like playing music. It's a performance. What we're doing here, we're trying to look back at history to see what happened when writing arrived, what happened when printing arrived, and now what happened when emojis arrived. Because we're trying to see back further. If we don't see the changes, then we'll think we can learn all we need to know about language by looking at emojis. And that's obviously not the case. So writing is very important, but printing is really, really important. Of course, the Chinese invented printing before the Europeans. And with printing, you get the distribution of texts so that everyone can have them. Until you get printing, if we have a text, hey, come, I've got a text, let's all read it together. Yeah? But now we have photocopiers, we have printers, and everyone gets pages and pages and pages. It's only then that you can think of the text as being self-contained. It's only then that this idea that I can put down the Da De Jing and say, that's the work. Because like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, earlier we would have taken this is a way to get to the work, but the work is in the reading, aloud. Yeah? Very, very strange. Now, these last 500 years, in which we've got printing, widespread distribution of texts, people are reading silently. It's only in this last 500 years, this is the time that science has existed, it's only in those 500 years that we've had this idea of a mind. Your mind, my mind. Now, the mind is a problematic thing. Is it a thing? It's an idea. It's a way of talking about people. Nobody's ever found a mind. Nobody knows where a mind is. A lot of people today seem to think a mind is something like a brain, or a mind is something like a computer. These are stories. That story is only 500 years old, since Descartes, who gave us this idea that we might have a mind. And it's only when you think that you have a mind that you can stuff in all this stuff, that reading can be all in the head. If we look at what people do, we're not forced to conclude that everything is in the head. We could look at reading as being something which started off as being a performance, as being something which we do out loud, and then we learn to do it silently. If you look at how a child learns language, they first learn to speak out loud. They have to learn then to be silent, to use their inside voice. Very young children speak their thoughts out loud. They have to learn to suppress the making of sound, so that, and in this way, we learn to think. Well, what we call, something we call thinking. Thinking is not a word like mind. It's not a word that has a good definition. But we do see regularly in children that they learn to language. Remember those children from the first day? They learn to language, and as they're doing so, they don't suppress things, they speak out loud. And then later they learn, about age 3 or 4, they learn to keep some things inside. The Russian psychologist Vygotsky has done the best studies on this. And since then, we know that thinking in language, thinking in thoughts, is something that you learn from an early age. Well, when we look back at the history of the media that are associated with languaging, we find that there's a story whereby initially the media allow us to do things again and again out loud, and then only much later, as they become freely distributed, do we learn to read silently, do we learn to take this view that we take in the work rather than perform the work. Now remember what we said about joint speech. It's a performance, it's something we take part in and we do it out loud. We had one limiting case which was being silenced together. We just put that over to one side. I'm not too worried about that case. In general, when we speak together in our rituals, we do it and we want to be heard and we want to be seen because we are creating a common world. Yeah? Okay, this is I see I planned the break a little earlier than I expected. Is it okay if we just take a 5 or 10 minute break here? And we'll pick this up because I think this is new to pretty much everybody. Story then was that there's two kinds of things in the universe. There's stuff, tables and chairs, stuff that takes up space. And there's thinking stuff, minds. But then you have to ask, how does the mind stuff interact with the material stuff? And this has been the whole of the problem of the philosophy of mind ever since. It's a terrible problem because it starts from the wrong place. But we're peering back 50,000 years now. We're looking back and trying to understand what kind of ape, what kind of animal we are. And when you do that, you don't see yourself as being separate from the world. You have to try and see yourself as being in the world. It's not an easy job. But the philosopher Descartes, D-E, Descartes, is associated with this adjective, Cartesian. And a Cartesian view is the one where I'm inside my head. So this, when we say that we are taking in a text, this idea is very Cartesian. It suggests that you're taking it inside yourself. This idea that there's an inside and an outside comes from Descartes. Is the camera recording again?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I just want to remind you, because I'm asking an awful lot of you. I'm asking you to make a big leap in thinking, which I'm still learning how to do myself. This is not easy. I was trained as a linguist, so I was trained that language starts with syntax, that it doesn't really matter whether it's spoken or not, that it's mostly inside heads and not between people, and that it's for passing messages. That's the way I was introduced to the study of language, and that's the way the study of language had been done. Now, then, nearly all the questions that are asked then are about systems, like the system of English or the system of Chinese. If you go back before writing, there's no English or Chinese. There's no borders between these things. You can't have English or Chinese unless you have the social structures necessary to teach people that's correct, that's incorrect. You must say it this way and not that way. This idea that there's an abstract system separate from what people actually do is an old one. Now, if we go back to Tierra del Fuego, where they had no reading and writing, we find different groups, and we would say they speak different languages, but these are not standardized languages, and they speak our language differently because they live separate lives. And the more they intermingle and intermarry, which they did, the more you can't find the border between language. So, when we're asking questions about English or Chinese, we're asking questions that depend on the existence of writing and curriculums and schools and teachers and spelling. We're not asking questions about what it was that changed our species. And for me, this is the leap I'm asking you to join me in. For me, the really interesting and difficult challenge is in starting to think about this question: what happens to our species? Because it's an entirely different question, and it results in an entirely different view of language. And that's why this is not in the textbooks. You're joining me in this difficult task. But joint speech is definitely part of this. It's part of it shows us that we create rituals which create our identity by making us who we are. And this view is simply incompatible with this view. It leads to consideration of all kinds of things. It doesn't guarantee that we're going to arrive at a single system. So that's why I like this verb, languaging. It makes us pay attention to what we used to think of as music, as something very, very separate, and other ways in which we do things together. Emojis travel very nicely over the internet, through the smartphones. You don't have to be in the same room as someone to send them to communicate using text or emojis. But for most of the history of the species, for 99% at least of the history of the species, when we coordinate our activities, we did so together with our bodies in the same room, like we are now. But for those of you watching the video, no. We are in the same room together. We share the air conditioning. Yeah. So this is a radically different way of thinking. But we're not the first people to think about this. Where did language come from? It's an old, old question. It's only recently, though, that this verb has become available and that we can start to think of languaging rather than language. When we look, as I said, at our nearest relatives, we don't see the kind of differences that we might like to explain this. So language doesn't leave fossils, and although there are some differences in the relevant parts of the anatomy between chimpanzees and humans, it's not enough to explain why we have these enormously powerful systems of communication and coordination, and apes don't. Did you ever get the feeling that things are changing very, very fast? Yeah? I haven't been in Beijing for 7 years, and things have changed an awful, awful lot in those 7 years. 7 years ago, the smartphones were almost invisible. You didn't have the bike schemes, you only had about a third of the subway system that you have. Things are changing fast, and the way we communicate is changing fast and fast. When something new happens, like the internet, the smartphone, the emoji, the printing press, it doesn't stop the old ways of communicating, it adds to them, but sometimes it changes the whole landscape of communication. So you may find that you're using your phone more than using your voice now. That's kind of surprising. When we're talking about something which is changing this quickly, and apparently ever more quickly, it's not clear that evolution is going to be the right sort of framework for talking about it. Evolution is a slow monster. You may all know this, in 1866, the French Academy of Science banned theories about the evolution of language. At that stage, it was clear if there's going to be any story about where language comes from, it has to be an evolutionary story. Evolution was the new kid on the block. Darwin's theory was very new. And nobody knew how to construct an evolutionary theory of language. They had lots of ideas. French scientists are very creative. You've seen Mr. Descartes, who messed everything up. But in order for science to work and be effective, we have to be able to tell the plausible stories from the implausible stories. That is, we have to be able to say, yeah, I might believe that, and no, that's a load of rubbish. Science really, really needs to be able to sort out its stories into the possibly believable and the complete rubbish. If we have no evidence, no empirical evidence, no evidence we can observe together, then we have no good way to sort out the many, many hypotheses. Now you might say we still have this problem in science. We do. We have a bizarre array of stories because the French Academy of Science, where they don't have the authority that they like to think they have. You can't stop people making up stories. You can't stop people coming up with accounts. And so people just ignored this ban. Yeah? So they said, if you're going to be doing science, you're not going to have any stories here because we've no evidence, so stop. In France, they like to try to regulate things you just can't regulate. They like to stop people using English, for example. So the French like to say le weekend for the weekend. And there are French authorities who like to try to keep English out of French. They have a bit of history there. And it doesn't work You cannot police language like that. So people have carried on coming up with stories about where language comes from. Not all of them now are evolutionary stories. So where we stay with the idea of the body, and we ask, well, what changes do you need in the body? One thing you might ask is, what structures and abilities have to be there in order for languaging to appear? Because it's a funny thing about language, there's no language organ. There's no part of the body that exists for language. Even that part of the brain that is often associated with speech, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, has lots and lots and lots and lots of other business going on. It does not appear for language. It's not there for language. There is no part of the body. You need your lungs to speak, but you need your lungs to breathe. You need your glottis to speak, but you need your glottis to stop your food going into your lungs. Swallowing gave us an awful lot of the meat with which we speak. So there's no part of the body that's there for language and languaging, or let's put it another way, your whole body is there for language and languaging. And now I think of those kids, we go dad, 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 and they're using their whole bodies at each other, right? That seems quite realistic. Recently we have computers, and we can run computer simulations, models of little agents who interact, who send messages to each other. And we can allow these to change over time. We can look to see if you start with simple messages and you allow things to change based on something. Do they get more complex? Does something like syntax emerge? So that's a new kind of thing. In 1866 they didn't have computers. They didn't have this kind of simulation. But we do now. So those are some things we can do. We can ask this pre-adaptation question. We can ask a computational question. And I said, we're probably not going to find an evolutionary story. But that hasn't stopped people looking for an evolutionary story. And when you look for an evolutionary story, you're probably talking about genetics, the genes. So, if languaging is what makes us human, and there's no guarantee that it is, or that it's one thing, lots of people think there should be a genetic story to tell. There must be something that we have, some biological thing that we have, that apes don't have. So it has to be genes, right? Now genetics, has anybody here taken a class in genetics? No? Genetics is a field that changes very quickly. There are lots of everyday understanding of what genetics is that are just wrong, that are not state of the art. Genetics has changed in the last 10 years hugely. There's almost no genetic variation between us and apes. There's tiny little differences. But the way that we think about genes and genetics, DNA, has changed hugely in the last few years. So the short answer here is no, there will be no genetic story, because that's not what genes are. We used to believe, if you go back 40 years ago, people thought that genes contain code that determines what kind of a creature you become. That's not the case. It is not the case. That is not the current understanding of genetics. Genes are very important in the development of an organism, but they do not dictate or control the development of an organism. And it is a mistake to ask of a gene, is this the gene for red hair? Is this the gene for speaking? The idea of a gene for has gone. Now, popular understanding of genetics moves much more slowly than the science of genetics. So maybe you've been still thinking along these lines. And indeed, if we go back to the 1970s and 1980s, we found there was a real hunger in the scientific community. We want a genetic story. We want to know what's the gene for language. So people went looking, and if you look you find. So there is a longer story to tell here, and we'll just have a look at this. It's an important one. The answer is there's no genetic story about language, but there was one interesting case. And this relates to a family who live in London. They're known in the literature as the KE family. And over 3 generations, there was a particular kind of speech disorder that about half the members of this family had, and about half of them didn't have. And we do know about genes, how problems with the genes is there are mutations, there are differences which get passed on from one generation to the next. And we know an awful lot about how that is. So we could tell there's a gene variant in this family that is producing a rare language disorder. Well, when this hit the headlines, the scientists went nuts. We found the gene for language. Now, the language problem that these people have in this family is called developmental verbal dyspraxia. That's a tough one to pronounce, and a verbal dyspraxia means you have difficulty pronouncing things. It doesn't mean you don't have language. It means you have difficulty pronouncing things. But the pattern of inheritance in this family tells us that there's a gene story here. And genes have strange names. This gene is called the FOXP2 gene. Go figure. Now, FOXP2 is an interesting gene. You find it in all mammals. And it's slightly different in chimpanzees than in humans, and it's slightly different in bats than in humans. So it's in bats as well, and rats, and pigs. It's slightly different in a way, but there is a mutation on FOXP2 in this family. Those people who have the developmental verbal dyspraxia have a problem with this gene, FOXP2. So is this the gene for language? That was the way it was reported. And the answer is absolutely 100% no, this is not the gene for language. That is not the idea. It turns out people were so eager to have a genetic story. They wanted a genetic story about language. So when this pattern, together with developmental verbal dyspraxia, was found, they said, we found it. When they went back and looked more carefully, here's what they found. They found that those people with the problem had other problems too. They had delayed onset of language, they had coordination difficulties with the hands, they had intellectual difficulties with learning, they did not specifically have language difficulties, they had general cognitive difficulties. And so this gene, if you have this mutation, it causes lots of problems in your life, and the problems have to do with coordination, but not specifically with language. Now here's something we do know about FOXP2, which is that it has to do with the co-development of brain and lungs. And that's true for mice, that's true for bats, that's true for humans, that's true for birds. So it should be no big surprise that if something goes wrong here, one of the symptoms will be a difficulty in speaking. Because to speak, you need to coordinate your lungs and everything else. All right? So people made very, very wrong, erroneous claims about finding the language gene back in the 1980s. And this was part of the belief which we all learned, which is that language is biological. It comes from the biology, it comes from the organism. But a few years ago I found a video of one member of this family, and here he is, and I'm going to have him talk to you to convince you that he is not lacking language. He's a lovely guy.
Other people today I'm going to talk about 5 things about me. 5 things about me. Let me think. Number 1. I have a rare speech disorder called FOX, if you want to know more information about that, you can. Is go to Google on the KE family. I'm famous in the medical history on that. Number 2, I have a learning disability.
That's a general cognitive disability.
But I can learn how to sort good things out from that. Number 3, when I was born, I learned sign language. Paget Gorman, and I changed to Macintyre, and I changed to...
I'm going to stop him here because I suspect you're not understanding him very well. He speaks with an English accent. He was born with, he was born with this disorder, which he misnamed, but that's okay. And his language onset was delayed, so he didn't learn to speak until he was 3 or 4, which is a bit late. So he learned sign language, and he learned various kinds of sign language very well. And now he likes to make tutorials for people to teach them sign language. So he's a most lovely character. He has a learning disability, he has a speech disability, and he's a gorgeous character, and he has language perfectly well. He's not lacking language. So, the origin of languaging cannot be attributed to a genetic change due to biological evolution. This idea that we are born with something in our brains that allows us to learn language is simply wrong. So what the hell happened? Do we have anything? I mean, something happened that changed us. We're a little bit different from the apes. Well, I want to tell you that there's one very beautiful hypothesis. It's only a hypothesis, and it's only part of the story. And it comes from the laboratory of Michael Tomasello in Germany. And it's called the cooperative eye hypothesis. It's very recent, it's 2007. So, what they pointed out is there is one biological difference between apes, chimpanzees and bonobos, and humans that might be extremely important, but it's nothing to do with brains or with the lack of hair. It has to do with the eye. We have a white eye. It's called the sclera, the white bit of the eyeball, and apes have a dark eyeball. Right? Now, if you have a white eyeball and a colored iris and a black pupil, that means it's very easy for someone to see where you're looking. You can all see where I'm looking even if I don't move my head. Yeah? We are extremely sensitive to where other people are looking. That means that we can coordinate well with other people because we pay attention to the same things. Now, if you have a young child, you'll find yourself paying attention to the same thing as that child an awful, awful lot. In fact, young children are bathed in joint attention. You see these two people? They're paying attention to the same thing. And from a very, very, very early age, young children learn to notice what you're looking at, then follow your eyes to look at the same thing, and before they're a year and a half old, they learn to control their parents. They learn to make their parents look where they want them to look. Faye, would you say this is true?
Very true.
Which means that from the youngest age, humans are paying attention to the same thing as other people around them. If you pay attention to the same thing, you've got the same opportunities for action, you interpret the world similarly, you perceive similar threats, you perceive similar opportunities, you have a common outlook. Now, if there's one thing we've learned from joint speech, it's that this common outlook is very, very important. Look at the difference. This is a chimpanzee head. Look at the dark eyes. It's hard to know where the chimpanzee is looking. Chimpanzees do care where other chimpanzees are looking, but they base it on where the head is and not on where the eyes are. This is an ape from the Planet of the Apes, the Hollywood movie. Look how clever that ape looks. Sneaky. He's got a white sclera. So Hollywood knows this. This looks really, really intelligent. In fact, that ape looks human. Right? Now, I'm not going to tell you that this white of the eye gave us language. But when we open for consideration the idea of languaging as patterns of activity, multiple ways in which we coordinate our activity, here's one that is biological, that's linked to evolution, but it's a tiny biological change. But you don't have to change much to change patterns of interaction. And when you change patterns of interaction, you change the way we coordinate and do our business. The smartphone is not a genetic product either. The emoji is not a genetic product. We won't find the emoji in our DNA. Look at the difference the smartphone has made to social organization. We're stupid without the damn things now. We can't get around, we can't pay for anything, I'm lost in Beijing, my phone doesn't work. Right? So it doesn't have to be a big change to the body to be a big change to the patterns of coordination across people. So, once more, languaging, the use of this term languaging encourages us to stop thinking of the passing of secret messages from one secret mind to another secret mind, and to pay attention to what's going on as we coordinate our activity. Now, coordination is all about working together with a common goal. And here I'm going to tell you joint speech is really important in this, because joint speech always happens when we come together with common purpose. It gives us our common purpose, the rituals, the activities in which we find it. We become non-independent, we become coordinated. This doesn't mean a lack of freedom. It means that what I do influences you and what you do influences me. Right now we are all really highly coordinated. You're listening to me, you're listening to me, you're paying attention to me, and I'm paying attention to you, and it's very, very tight, this coordination. We are cooperating and we're trying to reach shared understanding. So this small biological change in the eye might be a very, very important part of the puzzle. And I have begun to think that in developing our stories about language, we have missed the eye. We often think of language as something that has to do with words on a page. Of course, we need the eye to see the words, but we don't include that. When we talk, our eyes are really important. It was not clear, when they invented the telephone, it was not clear that people would be able to talk when they couldn't see each other, to communicate. Now we do this. If you're in the far room, we can shout at each other if we can't see each other. People can communicate back to back, and blind people can talk perfectly well. But people have to be trained to use the telephone, and the eyes, for 99.9% of the time that language has developed, the eyes have always been part of the business of coordinating. So I think there's a lot of things that we have sort of missed in the way that we've built one story about language. When we talk about Chinese or English, when we talk about syntax and phonology, we have left out all this. The eyes are extremely important, the whole body is important, the gestures are important, the things we do with our hands. You know, when people are on the phone, they still gesture, they have the phone in one hand and they have this hand is doing that, especially Italians. Yeah? If you make people sit on their hands, they're worse at thinking of words. So it takes longer to think of a word if you can't move your hands. Blind people gesture as well. When they're having a blind person talking to a blind person, they're still doing this. So that's obviously part of it. But what this gesturing and these eyes are not is categorical. It's not easy to find the kind of clear category distinction that we think of as defining language. So we were told, weren't we, that language is, there's some aspects of the voice are linguistic, some aspects of the voice are paralinguistic. That means not linguistic. So they have to do with, oh, I see you're drunk, or you have a cold, or you're depressed, or you're happy. And we're told that's not language, but the difference between p and b is language. Yeah? That focus is, it's important, but it gives us language one, which is the means for developing codes for communicating. It does not give us languaging. The eyes don't exhibit this categorical difference. The gestures are not categorical. Common timing, our bodies becoming entrained to each other. Even when talking, if you do careful measurements, you find the bodies lock together. Our common purpose is omitted from all this. It assumes, this view of language always assumes that we're sort of engaged in some kind of battle with each other. And in fact, when we speak of language in the textbooks, usually there's sort of two things. One is the sentence, which is considered without any context. The cat sat on the mat. John kicked the ball. We can look at the syntax of John kicked the ball. We can look at the phonology of John kicked the ball. What we don't look at is, who the hell is John? Why did he kick the ball? Was it his ball? Yeah. Joint speech is peculiar because it's obviously a big part of this story, and it has been ignored completely. There was no science of joint speech. And we always, so context is the reason that John kicked the ball. Context is the why John kicked the ball, the how John kicked the ball. All of this is missing. So as we open up from language to languaging, I want to suggest there's very many more things that we might look at. I'm going to show you just a little bit of a small study I did on the eyes. So there's the eye there. That's not actually how it works. This is much more boring. Science is much more boring. So this is a corpus. I didn't collect the corpus myself. I just use it. And the corpus had people having conversations. In the laboratory, please have a conversation. Oh, all right, what do you want us to talk about? Just talk. So people sat down opposite each other, and you've got a camera behind each of them. So there's a camera behind her filming him. There's a camera behind him filming her. They're actually staring at each other. And they talk for 15 minutes. And we've got lots of these. There's 8 pairs that I analysed, 15 minutes conversation each. Here's what the analysis looks like. It's really, really boring. So this is one person, this is the other person. But unlike most phonetic analysis, what I'm looking at here is who's gazing at who's looking at who, and when do they blink. Turns out it matters when you blink. It turns out blinks are part of language as well. But gazing at each other, I'm not going to talk about blinks today because they're not categorical, but you see something in blinks. But you really, really see it very strongly in the gaze. When two people are having a conversation, we often say they take turns. Yeah? They don't take turns. Chess players take turns. Look at boxers in the ring. Do boxers take turns? If boxing doesn't go like this. Okay, you hit me. Okay, now I'm going to hit you. That's taking turns. Boxers, one of them starts hitting, and then as soon as he can, the other one starts. That's what conversation is like. Huh? We listen to it. Okay, it's a bit more polite than boxing. It's not a fight, but it's a negotiation. It's not simply alternation. In a political debate, we get turn taking. Sir, your turn. Madam, your turn. But not in a conversation. And when you look at this negotiation, then the eyes become very, very important. When I start to speak in a two-person conversation like this, if I start to speak, once I start to speak, I tend to look away. And you as a listener, look at me. You're looking for the opportunity to get in there. And I'll come back to check that you're paying attention, but I'll look away again. And if I'm coming to the end of what I want to say, I'll look back to you, and as soon as you pick up and start speaking, you'll look away. And we'll alternate these roles. So here's just some data from these conversations. Each of these is a single person in a particular pair. And the top one shows the amount of time, the proportion of time in which the person looked at the other person when they were a listener. And the bottom one shows the proportion of time gazing at the other person when you're speaking. And what you can see is when you're listening, you're always looking at the other person much more than when you're listening. Than when you're speaking. So the speaker is free to look away. The listener must keep their eye on the other person. It's not categorical, so it's not 100%. It's not clear boundaries. But those differences, like take this person. When this person is listening, they're staring at the other person. When this person is speaking, they're looking away. So you can see there's a dance going on here, which is part of what it is to have a conversation. This is only a tiny little entry into the magic world of the eyes in language. There's lots of work to do out there. If you're short of a thesis topic, looking at the eyes in conversation would be something you can really, really do. Here's another way that joint speech is different from conversational speech. In conversational speech, we have this negotiation, and we're using our eyes. We're paying attention to where the other person is looking. In joint speech, there's basically two ways the eyes work. One is we have a common focus, so there's a priest there and everybody's staring at the same thing. Or maybe it's a rock star on stage. Everyone's staring at the same thing. Or we can free, the eyes are completely free, they can look where they like. So that's the other thing that we find, which is kind of interesting. So the eyes in joint speech work very differently from the eyes in conversation. And of course, gestures in joint speech work very differently from gestures in everyday conversation. Gestures in joint speech might be improvised, or they might be codified, turned into a system, and there might be the right and the wrong gesture, but they're very different from the gesture in conversation, like this. So in joint speech, we find no speaker-listener difference. We find the eyes are working different. We find the gestures are working different. What I want to do, what I'm trying to do here, and what I've done in this lecture and the last one, is said that this shift from thinking about language, which we're all used to studying, to languaging, which is largely unexplored. This greatly changes what we think we are, what we think language is, what we think the difference between humans and animals are, how we think of the human world. So what you find when you go in to ask questions about language depends on the question that you ask. The first question is, how do we encode messages? You find syntax, phonology, and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. The other question, what happened to our species? You find lots and lots and lots of different things. So in the next two lectures, I'm going to talk much more about coordination. I don't have a map of this territory. The territory is far too big. But we'll be looking at musical aspects of coordination. We'll be looking at that grey area between language and music. We'll be looking at rhythm as it occurs in speech as well as how it occurs in music. We'll be looking at melody. We'll be looking at these kinds of things. So we've started with joint speech, which was an exotic topic. Now we've moved our consideration of what language is to a wider field in which there's far more things to pay attention to. And everything we learned about syntax and phonology is fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's maybe not so relevant anymore. Maybe there's lots and lots of other questions we might have. And so in the next 2 lectures, we'll just be sampling some points here, because there's lots and lots of work to be done. And don't think of this as being separate from the way you communicate in your daily life. The introduction of emojis here was not a joke. The talk of the importance of the smartphones and social media is not a joke. Things are changing very, very quickly. Patterns of human interaction are changing. And this changes our relationship to the authorities, our relationship to our tribes, to our families, to our groups. We are becoming global in a way that my friends from Tierra del Fuego could never have imagined. Right? So this, I hope, is where we need to look if we want to do language studies in the 21st century. God knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years. So I'm going to stop there for today, but let's open it up for discussion. Anybody want to pitch in? We're done otherwise.